Welcome to Sputnik, still orbiting the world in the time of the corona. With me, George Galloway. Stripped down wartime conditions. No Gayatri, she's on maternity leave. It's hard to believe that it's 30 years since the great poll tax demonstration, which ended in a riot and ended the political career of the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, hitherto absolutely unassailable. It broke the back of the poll tax. Now, what was the poll tax? I hear younger viewers asking. The poll tax was the most regressive tax ever introduced in Britain since the Middle Ages, which took absolutely no account of the person's ability to pay it. The dustman had to pay the same poll tax as the Duke, whose bins at the castle he was having to empty. It engendered widespread anxiety, anger amongst the population. But that anger had to be organised if the tax was going to be successfully opposed. It was at that time that I first came upon a young man of fantastic talent, great drive, wonderful orator, and still a very, very young man. I knew then that we'd be together forever, and I knew then that he'd go on to be a very big name indeed, as he did. The leader of the anti-poll tax campaign, the Can't Pay, Won't Pay campaign, was a young Glasgow man called Tommy Sheridan. He even defended my house when the sheriff's officers, that's the Scottish equivalent of bailiffs, came to break the door down, steal my furniture and sell it on the pavement. I'm not making that up. But the bold Tommy was there with his men, and the sheriff officer turned tail and fled. I'm glad to say, 30 years on, we're still together, and I'm interviewing him this time. Tommy Sheridan, welcome on board the Sputnik. These were tumultuous days. Talk about them from your memory, your standpoint.
George, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. And you and I probably share some of the traits of humanity which sometimes get frowned upon, one of them being vanity. And you and I have to accept that 30 years is a long time ago, when we were much younger and much fitter and had actually had hair in our heads, George, in those days.
You need to get a hat, Tommy. You need to get a hat.
I'm going to have to take up the hat. George, those were times when we were told, and you can recall this, you were in the Houses of Parliament, you had to face up to that wretched woman on a daily basis. We were told that Thatcher was the Iron Lady. She was unbeatable. She'd taken on and defeated the miners. She'd taken on and defeated Galtieri in Argentina. There was no way that we could defeat her and her poll tax. That was, you remember, she called it the flagship, the flagship of her third term. George, we decided to try and unite the communities of Scotland. And let's face it, we organised the anti-poll tax unions, but it wasn't Tommy Sheridan, George Galloway or any other individual that was the best recruiting sergeant for the anti-poll tax army. It was poverty itself. After years and years of Thatcherism, many people were on their knees and they simply couldn't afford to pay. What we did is we gave the movement some backbone. We said to each and every one, if you allow them to come for you as an individual, they'll pick you off. But if we join together, we can stop the sheriff officers, we can stop the bailiffs, and we can make the poll tax uncollectible and therefore unworkable. And you'll remember, you were probably there that day when the mild-mannered John Major had to stand up in Parliament and announce that the poll tax was to go because it had become uncollectible.
All of this was achieved against the advice and in the absence of the official Labour and trade union movement. As a Labour MP, I was shunned and attacked for refusing to pay my poll tax, almost disciplined. Labour had set its face entirely against this anti-poll tax movement, and the TUC was not much better. Why? Why was that the case, particularly in the unions?
It was a grasping, George, for this whole idea of being establishment, being laudable, being respected. How could you possibly support a campaign that breaks the law? Because let's remember it, not paying your poll tax was against the law. What really irked me was the poll tax was universally described by the Labour Party, by the TUC, as unfair and immoral. Immoral, that was the word that was used all the time, George. I couldn't comprehend as a young lad in those days, was if something was immoral, why the hell were we paying it? Surely if it's immoral, then you've got to make a stand. These people forget that the tall puddle martyrs broke the law. That's what gave us trade unionism. The popular councillors in London broke the law in order to give us council housing. The rent strikers in Glasgow broke the law in order to prevent the rents getting hiked during the First World War. Breaking the law when law is unjust is part and parcel of the history of the movement. And these people, I think they showed a lot of shame and a lot of ignorance of their very own history, because the Labour Party and the TUC wouldn't exist if it wasn't for socialists in the years before being brave enough to break bad laws.
Now, the reason why I, and much more so you, as the leader of the campaign, were thrust onto the front line, and national prominence, I suppose you'd have to say, was because Scotland had been singled out as the test bed, the guinea pig for the whole experiment. It was introduced in Scotland a year before England. Tell us about that.
George, you'll remember the 1979 election, which unfortunately ushered in Thatcher and the beginning of Thatcherism. She was rejected in Scotland in 79. She won in 83. She was rejected in Scotland in 83. She won again in 87. She was rejected in Scotland in 87. She hated Scotland because Scotland never ever took to Thatcher. Scotland rejected Thatcher at every single election. And she thought she would give us our comeuppance. She thought she would show an example by making us a political guinea pig. We were to get the poll tax 1 year before England and Wales. We were the testing bed, the live guinea pigs for this community charge, as it was called in those days. It soon became universally known as the poll tax. In Scotland, the law was a civil law. You didn't go to jail for not paying your poll tax in Scotland. You did go to jail for not paying your poll tax in England. However, by the time we got to 1990, when we were trying to convince people in England and Wales to refuse to pay, we weren't starting from a blank page. We already had 1 million Scots who were refusing to pay.
They did, of course, put you in jail over the poll tax, and you were actually elected to the Glasgow City Council from your prison cell in Saughton. I'm not sure if anyone has ever done that before. I'm sure no one will ever do it again. It wouldn't be allowed. But it was a remarkable event. Tell us quickly, briefly about that.
George, it's important that I stress that I was put in jail for stopping what was called a poll tax warrant sale.
Yeah, like
in England,
you did.
They have a different system.
Yeah, quite like you did at my house. You turned up at my house to stop them breaking down my door, stealing my furniture and selling it for the debt. And then they put you in jail for doing it elsewhere.
What happened on the 1st of October 1991, George? We had a report that a young single parent from Greenock in the west of Scotland had already had her house broken into. She didn't know they were coming. The sheriff officers came in, They broke her house and they left her a note. They took her coffee table, they took a display cabinet, and they took a television. And they left her a note. And believe me or not, this is true. They told her she was to go to the local sheriff officers, Abernethy McIntyre in Greenock, and she was to pay for the cost of the locksmith to change the lock on her door. They'd taken these items of furniture from her house and they intended to sell it on the 1st of October 1991. Myself and hundreds of others said, you're not on. Because if they got away with that sale, they'll get away with every other sale. We had to show some human solidarity, George. So we got together, hundreds of us, and we were prepared to go to Turnbull Street in Glasgow. It was an old police station, actually, at the back of the district court, and we were prepared to go there in our hundreds. But the day before it, George, the day before it, like scurrying rats in the middle of the night, I got a wee note put through my door in Pollock in Glasgow for these two sheriff officers. And it was an interim interdict was shoved through the door and then they scuttled away. And this interdict told me that if I went to that warrant sale and I would be held in contempt of court. Well, at the end of the day, George, sometimes you've got to do what is the right thing, not always the legal thing. So I decided that I was going there with the hundreds of others, and we stopped the warrant sale, George. Stopped it, and we stopped every other warrant sale from taking place. It was a great day of human solidarity. Unfortunately for me, the authorities decided to take me to the High Court in Edinburgh in January of 1992, and they charged me with contempt of court. I had ripped up the warrant. I ripped it up on national telly. I said, this is a worthless piece of paper. It won't stop us from expressing human solidarity with a fellow poll tax protester. I ended up getting 6 months in jail for that, George. It was quite an expensive wee bit of paper, obviously. I get 6 months and socked in jail. While I was in there, George, I stood, I don't know if you remember the April 92 general election. I stood as a candidate in Glasgow Pollock, and from nowhere I came second. I got 20% of the vote. However, in the May local elections, I decided to stand also for the council. And I was elected from my prison cell to serve on Glasgow City Council. But I couldn't take my seat because I was still in jail. I couldn't take it until the 1st of July. And that's when I took up my seat in the City Council. So there you go. They sent me to jail. I remember the headline in the Daily Record was "Downfall of the Dodger." I was led away in the handcuffs. A couple of months later, I was carried shoulder high into Glasgow City Chambers as an elected councillor. So that was certainly one in the eye for the establishment.
You're some man, Tommy Sheridan. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.